Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I'm Dr. James Spencer here with Richard Beattie, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on Christian nationalism through the lens of Neighborly Faith's report on Christian nationalism. And specifically, we're going to be talking about one of the statements that Christian nationalist adherents, based on this study, agreed to or strongly agreed to, which is the true culture of the United States is fundamentally Christian. And so the goal today is just to unpack that a little bit and try to understand why it is that strong agreement with that statement is really problematic from a biblical and a theological perspective.
Yeah, I like this whole premise because you think we were just talking about true culture. That's a loaded that's a loaded name right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's difficult because there's a lot of phrasing in here. Specifically culture. Culture is notoriously difficult to define. And when we think about the United States as a pluralistic nation, it's probably going to be very hard for us to boil down what we actually mean in terms of a single culture in the United States. Now, obviously, there probably needs to be some sort of a shared vision of what the United States is doing and where it's going, and a certain set of values that everybody can agree on would be fantastic. But to suggest that there is a single culture and that that culture is fundamentally Christian, I think probably dives into some other assumptions that we'll want to get into as we continue to discuss this.
Right. And then when you think about if we did have just one culture and everybody agreed with each other, it wouldn't be America, would it?
That's the trouble. I think, there's part of me with all of these conversations that we're going to have on these various statements that I think we just need to clarify that, the United States is not unlike any other nation, that it's always going to have its problems. And because the way that human beings go about solving those problems is through very human methods, human wit and wisdom, we could say, it's always going to yield very similar things. So you can solve a near-term problem or a very specific problem through human, let's say, human technology. And I don't mean technology in terms of like the devices we hold in our hands, but just sort of the rational, technical abilities that all of us have. So you can solve those kind of problems and you can make things work. But normally, what that's going to do is it's going to result in other problems. Most of our fixes are actually going to yield additional problems. And then there's almost always going to be a remainder. So if we think about it in terms of, sort of, we want to fix it for everyone, but we're very seldom going to find a fix that fixes everything for everyone. And so, as we focus on a solution, this is where Thomas Sowell, who's sort of a famous conservative economist, talks about there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so, what we're doing as we implement a solution is we're usually deciding as a collective what is the most important thing to solve for. And then we are solving for that and we are leaving other things unsolved.
Right. So, how does that um, how does that fit in with this whole Christian nationalism? And are we calling Christian nationalism a movement, or is it? And Of course, we've questioned its its validity in being Christian. So
Yeah, I would say I would probably call it a movement. It has a number of different species. There's been a lot written about what actually Christian nationalism specifically is. And so there are different species. Actually, Gospel Coalition has a great article online about this. I'd encourage people to Google it. It's very helpful. But they talk about different forms of Christian nationalism, one being, folks who think that Christianity is and should continue to be influential in the United States. And so, in other words, in a constitutional republic like we live in, Christians should have the opportunity to influence government, right? Just like everybody else. And so,
Right.
from an American standpoint, Christians aren't really all that different than anyone else. And so, we should be able to weigh in on policy. We should be able to vote for our representatives, which we do. And so, the apparatus of government are open to Christians just like they would be to anyone else.
Right.
And probably at our founding, there were many Christians, and there was a sort of a predominance of Christians, let's say, that would have influenced the way America was essentially governed and structured from the founding documents through the initial structures and all that kind of good stuff.
Right.
I think often that history is overstated. We tend to sort of be a little bit anachronistic when we think about today's government and the way that the federal government interacts with the states. Federal government tends to have a little bit more power than the state governments today. But back when the nation was founded, that was almost flipped. The federal government had a lot less control and power over each one of the states, and the states were trying to navigate different questions in and of themselves. And so, even as we think back on that early history, I think we have to just be careful not to assume that it was like it is today. What we
Mm-hmm.
have today is the fruit of those struggles that people were going through back then. But that's one way of understanding Christian nationalism. In that sense, I think most Christians are probably, if that were the sense of Christian nationalism we're talking about, most Christians would probably fall into that category.
Right.
Most Christians believe that they can and should be able to, as American citizens, participate in the apparatus of government,
Mm.
right? That's not a overly crazy statement or anything like that.
Right.
Then there's another form of Christian nationalism that argues not only that we were founded by Christians for Christians and to be a Christian nation, but that we should go back to that.
Mm.
And that it doesn't get quite theocratic, right? Theocratic meaning that we should just be a nation under God, that we should reinstitute Mosaic law and use, only the Bible to govern, sort of our civil life. But it does mean that there's often conversation around Christian principles, Christian ideas, Christian values, all those kind of phrases
Right.
that should be really driving what America is and does.
Mm.
The neighborly faith study actually defines Christian nationalism, and they have a very specific way that they're understanding Christian nationalism. And if I can find it real quick, I'll read it. But it says, as I recall, their form of Christian nationalism also had to do with sort of working within a particular race. And so there was a racial component to the way that they understood Christian nationalism and were trying to understand Christian nationalism in this study.
Right. I do have a question. The resistance to Christian nationalism is probably, I mean, it's really off the charts. I mean, when you think that a filmmaker is making a film about this, and kind of equating all of Christianity, including the church, into this, lumping it all in together with that. You wrote a book called Christian Resistance, and that also that actually was partially, when you look at it, really is resisting some of these tendencies that the Christian nationalism group seems to be working on.
Yeah, I think, and I did find this definition, which I think will kind of inform your question. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. But the neighborly faith study actually defines Christian nationalist as follows: Christian nationalism is a movement advancing a vision of America's past, present, and future that excludes people of non-Christian religions and non-Western cultures.
Ah,
Um,
so it's the exclusion of other other
that's right.
people and other philosophies,
Right.
if you will, or even other religions.
Yeah, and it goes on to just say it romanticizes Christianity's influence on America's development, attributing a nation's historical provenance to God's special favor, toward its rightful inhabitants. Some scholars identify a relationship between Christian nationalism and white nationalism. Although not inextricably bound together, the two often relate and reinforce each other throughout history.
Right.
And so when we understand Christian nationalism in that way, where it is leaning into an exclusionary sort of uh, mode of governance, you can understand why people are pushing back.
Right.
The assumption that even if America were founded and I think this is important when we read this statement and we talk about the fundamental culture of the United States is Christian, or that
Hmm.
Christianity is embedded within the fundamental culture of the United States.
Right.
This is where I think probably people are thinking that when the founders went about forming the structures and writing the founding documents of our nation, that they intended them to be explicitly Christian.
Right.
I have some difficulty understanding that, given that Christ is never mentioned. And so it's a very complex history, and I don't mean that to be a sort of trite and pithy response,
Right.
right? But you can find instances very early in our country where recommendations to include specifically Christian language in various governmental policies were excluded from the actual policies that were ultimately adopted.
Right.
You can also find trends in which religious tests, for instance, for government service, which were explicitly Christian, were ultimately, and again, fairly early, right? Early 1800s to mid 1800s,
Hmm.
maybe even into like 1890s, were repealed
Right.
because, we had Jews living in America that couldn't affirm the New Testament in its inspired document. We had Jews living in America who weren't going to proclaim Christ. You had other nationalities and other just different ideological perspective. Atheists weren't going to affirm any of this, and so you eventually have the elimination, I think, of religious tests altogether, but that's a little bit later. But
Hmm.
these skirmishes were happening early on.
Right.
And they were struggling through what does it look like to have, a government that can accommodate multiple religious expressions.
Hmm.
Many times that was framed in terms of differences between denominations. So, just as for instance, the Danbury Baptist letter that is so big in the separation of church and state conversation, the Danbury Baptists are writing to Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson writes back and talks about the separation of church and state.
Hmm.
But the impetus for the Danbury Baptists to write the letter is that Connecticut, the state where they were located, had a state established church.
Right.
It was the Congregational Church.
Hmm.
That was ultimately repealed because what people finally kind of realized was that, well, my gosh, what happens if another denomination, maybe Unitarians were big back then? What if the Unitarians gather a majority and they become then the state established church?
Church.
We're all
Yeah.
going to be paying for the Unitarians, and we don't want to do
Hmm.
that. And so early on, you have these sort of interdenominational skirmishes with regard to state establishment of the church, right? Which
Right.
wouldn't necessarily um, argue against Christian specifically.
Right.
But as those arguments are worked out, there's a realization that, oh gosh, it doesn't just apply to interdenominational kind of things. It also applies to other religious expressions, agnosticism, atheism. And honestly, the free exercise clause accommodated that forever in the First Amendment. And
Hmm.
so I think that my point in all this is just to say that when we talk about America's fundamental culture being Christian,
Right.
if I were really going to sort of nail that down and say, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
From a biblical and theological perspective, I would almost have to include um, salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ in that definition of what it means to be fundamentally Christian.
Right.
If we mean something more like we're America was founded on moral principles abstracted from the biblical text and separated from their theological content,
Hmm.
I can get my head around that.
Yeah. But isn't that really what's missing when you look at Christian nationalism? I don't hear, except the Bible being quoted out of context, in some of the arguments about us being a Christian nation.
think it's really tough. I mean, I think, there's a sense in which um, the church is the realm of God's people,
Hmm.
right? It's what we belong to. Intrinsically, that's who we are.
Right.
And I hesitate to use this word, but I can't think of a better one. The other places we find ourselves are sort of coincidental. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to deny God's sovereignty in putting us where we are,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
But the point of saying it's coincidental is to suggest that it is, in many ways, provisional.
Right.
We can move.
Yeah.
A nation may collapse while we're still Christians. I think we find this in Paul, where he talks about, if you're um, remain as you are when you were saved,
Right.
right? But that doesn't imply that things won't change. And I think he suggests that when he's talking to the slaves, and he says, you're a slave when you are, when you find Christ, remain a slave. But if you can gain your freedom, go ahead and get your freedom.
Hmm.
And so I think what his point there is that these areas where you're placed when God calls you is where God intends you to be as he calls you.
Right.
Not that he would never call you anywhere else,
Hmm.
but these are the places where Christians are rubbing shoulders with other people who are enslaved to sin.
Right.
And so we operate within a sinful world as members of the church. That's how we are salt and light. That is how we are a light to the nations. That is how we are, sheep among wolves. You name almost any biblical metaphor, there you have it.
Right.
And so we have to be in the world, and we have to be working within that world. The
Mm.
question is whether or not and this I think is the crux of it really for me with Christian nationalism, is that uh, not the governing authorities. The governing authorities are established by God, appointed by God,
Right.
right? Love to think that some of those governing authorities are also guided by the Holy Spirit. That would be fantastic, right? But surely not all of them. And
Right.
definitely, I think it's demonstrable throughout history. It has not been that way.
Hmm.
And so a lot of our governing authorities are determining uh, in their own terms how they are going to solve the problems that confront them. What are the processes going to be? What does this need to look like? How are we going to address X, Y, or Z problem? Whatever that may be. And so for Christians to step in and say, well, let's make sure that we're helping the world be the best possible world that can be, is to surrender that world to death.
Right.
Christians have to engage as Christians, which means that even as we're trying to go about doing some of the technical things that we need to do to survive in a fallen world, we can't do those things without reference to salvation.
Right.
And so I see no point, and this is the real crux of it for me, I think. I don't see any point to having a nation exercising moral principles drawn from the Bible if
Mm.
at the same time we don't have gospel proclamation.
Yeah.
Enforcing morality is of limited value, not of no value, but
Hmm.
it's of limited value. It's a restraining force, right? It's making sure that people don't go off the rails completely as they sort of are slaves to sin, as they act out of the flesh.
Right.
And so it's important, and it's a role that's given to the state, but the
Mm.
church has a different path that it's supposed to be following.
Right.
And so we can never surrender that path, even when we dip in and we start working within the what I would call the technical or political or economic sides of the world that we live in.
Right. Well, and when you look at it, and I'm listening to you speak, and I'm thinking about the schisms that are within denominationalism, all of those things, and you say, now, I know that probably some of these, or a lot of members of, let's say, the United Methodist Church, are not probably part of this Christian nationalism movement. So how are we defining Christian in this whole movement?
Well, and why don't we take a quick break because that's a
Yeah.
whole bag of worms in and of
Oh
itself
yes, it
that
is.
I think we can dive into after the break. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what I think it means, and I think beyond that, not what I think it means, because who cares what I think, but what biblically it means to be Christian.
Great.
So we'll be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. We are going to talk a little bit about, so before the break, we were going to talk a little bit about what it means to be Christian. And so, biblically, Christian, the actual word Christian, is only used three times, twice in Acts, once in First Peter. That's it. That's all we got. The First Peter reference, I think, is important. It is connected with Christ and Christ's suffering, which to have Christian connected with Christ would seem fairly logical. And so it seems that that's what Peter is doing when he calls his audience Christians. If you suffer for being a Christian, and then he connects that to the sufferings of Christ. In Acts, it's really interesting. In Acts, the believers, the Jews who are following Christ, were generally referred to as the Way.
Right.
And this way was considered to be a sect of Judaism. So, the Jews were not happy, right, with this sect, the Way, who was proclaiming to follow Jesus as Messiah and who claimed that he had been resurrected. They weren't happy with them at all. But they weren't calling them something other than the Way and viewing them as a sect of Judaism until the incorporation of the Gentiles in Acts 11. Once the Gentiles enter the church, now what you have is a multitude of Jews and non-Jews united in Jesus Christ who are going to be called Christians.
Right.
And so when we look at it biblically, Christ is central to what it means to be Christian. He's kind of built into the name. But I think also from a narrative perspective, what we see is it is the mixed multitude of Jews and Gentiles united in Christ that constitute that is the referent for the word Christians. And so when we're using it as an adjective to describe things, I can get my head around something like Christian doctrine, right? The
Right.
things that the mixed multitude of Jews and non-Jews united in Jesus Christ believe, right? I can get my head around a Christian church or a Christian congregation,
Right.
right? A local community of people united in Christ gathering together. I don't know exactly what we would mean by a Christian nation.
Yeah.
I don't understand how I could explain that unless that nation were fully made up of redeemed people.
Right.
And so it's difficult for me to square even the term if I'm using the biblical understanding of Christian. And the reality is, words change over time, right? This happens, And so my thought is that when we're using the word Christian nowadays, and particularly Christian nation, Christian nationalism, all of these kind of words, what we're really talking about is something that's more Christian adjacent.
Okay. Right.
And what I mean by that is um, there is a willingness to loose the word from its theological commitments in order to describe some of the ethical, moral, social, just general wholesome ideas that can be drawn from the religion's teaching and sacred books.
Right.
But I think in no way would I say that what we can institute as a Christian nation are, the two greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
At best, we're shooting at love your neighbor or suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what states do.
Right. But
So that's my take on Christian, Richard.
right, and when you think about it, and you think about the Church of England, we're not the Church of America. We're not the that when you separate out the word church from Christian, that's and as you say, Christian adjacent.
Yeah.
That's an interesting, as far as words go, but
Yeah.
also as far as meaning. What did Jesus? Uh, what did he tell Peter?
Yeah.
What the church was, what the church would become.
That's right. And it's really interesting. I mean, I think that part of this comes up post what's usually referred to as post Christendom,
Right.
right? Christendom was sort of a fusion of state and church, where there was a different sort of interrelationship between state and church. And there
Mm-hmm.
was an assumption that Christianity was the religion of the realm, and that because Christianity was the religion of the realm, everyone was basically a Christian.
Right.
Now, it is a gross oversimplification of that, right?
Yeah.
So, any scholar who's listening out there, forgive the gross oversimplification, but that's essentially Christendom. It's this odd fusion between the state and the church,
Right.
right? And an ongoing assumption that Christianity is going to be the religion of the realm. And so after Christendom, we start to see some of these things happen. I actually think the problem is sort of exacerbated in the United States because we've had the ability, and rightly, I think within a democracy, we have the ability to participate in government, and we've had a history in which the Bible and Christians have played a significant role in shaping the nation. I
Right.
don't have any reason to think that that's not the case.
Right.
And so I think there's this impression that, hey, we should retain this fusion and merger, right, between church and state. And that's where we get the term Christian nation. It's a
Mm-hmm.
merger of sorts. But the reality is that whatever happens on the human level, the church and state can't be merged. It just can't be. Like, God establishes these entities. That's part of what it means when God says he grants and delegates the authority to the governing authorities.
Mm-hmm.
God's doing that. It's not our decision.
Right. Right.
And so when God establishes the church, that's not us going, it'd be great if we just got all together and started worshiping Jesus together. That's not our call. That's
That's
something that
true.
God has established. And so it wasn't like a human innovation that this thing, oh, let's, what we should do? Form a church. No, it's something that God gives. And so that makes it definitionally difficult,
Yes.
right? The theological identities aren't going to pair. They're not going to fuse because God did not create them to be that way. He did not appoint them to be that way.
Right.
And so
D-
at best, I think they're complementary entities.
Right, and then you bring in the word religion, and you open a whole other can of worms,
So
right?
yeah, it's a whole other
So-
deal.
and
Yeah, I
and and
mean,
that's really what we have here. We have those three words that are somewhat together, and then other times, and by design, are
yeah,
totally separate from each
yeah,
other.
yeah. I mean, I think, religio and in the Latin, right? It doesn't have to refer to what we usually think of as religion, like an established religious institution with a building and very specific liturgies and usually a sacred book and those kind of things. Like we don't, it doesn't have to refer to that. It can refer to almost what we would liken to habitual practice
Right.
and common underlying belief systems of those habitual practices. And so I think it's possible, and this is something that a lot of political theologians actually argue, is that the realm of politics often borrows from the realm of religion or theology in order to describe politics
Right.
and to institute what is often referred to as secular liturgies.
Right.
And so we have the liturgies in churches where we, maybe we have a prayer, we have a benediction, we do the Lord's Supper in a particular way, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a cadence that we go through with that. that would be more familiar probably to people in mainline denominations than in, let's say, non-denominational churches these
Right.
days. But the point is that these rituals that we go through are going to shape us in particular ways as we go through them.
Right.
And so there's an argument out there, again, from certain political theologians that discuss the way that the state implements rituals in order to foster devotion to the state.
Mm.
And so something as simple as, I can remember growing up pledging allegiance to the flag.
Right.
Now, the Pledge of Allegiance, it sort of becomes a common part of our vernacular, and so we don't exegete it very well. We don't actually think about what it is that we're saying. But if you
Right.
actually just think about it, the Pledge of Allegiance, I am now pledging my allegiance, my devotion to the country.
Right.
And even though they eventually added under God, my understanding is it was added in the 50s.
That's correct.
Um, yeah, and so even though they add under God, it's still more of a generic reference to God.
Hmm.
And even if it was intended by the people who added it to refer to the triune God, it's broad enough to encompass more than just the triune God. And so what we're seeing is sort of what I would call a civil religion coming in and saying, we think that because we're a pluralistic society, it's still important to have all of these religious faiths and they can all operate so long as they do not keep people from being good citizens.
Right. Right.
But what we really need is we need them to pledge allegiance to the flag.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
all of that is, I'm not trying to sound anti-American here at all. I don't really have any problem with saying that there is a level of respect and submission that we should give to the nation in which we live. That is absolutely a biblical notion, and we should submit to those authorities as we're submitting to God. And what I take that to mean is that our first service is always to the Lord, our second service is to the nation, and that in serving the Lord, we actually serve the nation best.
Mm.
That again, phrasing it like that, I think is part of the problem with Christian nationalism.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think one of the things that I would think was very damaging was that whole idea of the patriot movement. And patriotism became something that it never was intended to be, like so many other things. And that was, if you were a patriot, you were you were like a general in the Christian nationalism is a movement, and
Yeah.
I think some of those things have been very very confusing because I think there's a lot of people who love their country, but they don't worship it like they worship God,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes you feel threatened by people who are in the Christian nationalism group and equate and put God and the nation up at the same place.
Well, and I'll say this. When I was first starting my Master of Divinity, I was probably maybe it was my second year. My wife and I were living in Chicago, and we had Mormons come and visit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a young, aspiring theologian, I decided it'd be a great idea to stand on our stoop and just have a conversation with them. And what I learned from that conversation is it's extremely difficult to have a biblically based argument with people who are using the exact same language, the same words you're using,
Right? Exactly.
but the concepts behind them are completely different.
They
They're
are.
just completely different. And this is where I find the trouble with what I would phrase as civil religion. And this comes out of the work of like Robert Bella, who is a sociologist of religion. He talks about America's civil religion, and I think there's really good evidence that what we have in a lot of ways is an American civil religion.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, an incorporation of religious elements in service to the state,
Right.
not an incorporation of religious elements that point to and magnify Jesus Christ.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's a fair distinction between the two.
Yeah.
And so what you end up with in civil religion is you end up with ambiguities in language, making it seem as though we're saying the same thing, even though we're not.
Right.
And so that's where I have difficulty. Something that I've looked at here recently. Joe Biden gave I think it was a speech on transgender visibility day, I believe is what it's called. Um, and at the end of this speech, where he's kind of talked through all his different points, he ends it and says, "Everyone is made in the image of God and deserving of dignity." It's not a direct quote, but it's the general idea. And he does use the
Right.
image of God language there.
Yeah.
And I remember reading through the speech and saying to myself, well, he's right. We're all made in the image of God and we're all deserving of dignity.
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Right.
But the image of God entails more than dignity. In other words, dignity comes with some responsibility, some obligation, because being made in God's image means that we are supposed to glorify Him. We're supposed to reflect His glory to the world.
Right.
And so, if we really want that dignity for people, we really want them to embody what it means to be in the image of God,
Mm-hmm.
we have to proclaim the gospel to them.
Right.
We can't leave them to their own devices because even though substantively they are made in God's image, I believe that all people are made in God's image and they are all deserving of dignity. But if we want to amp that up,
Mm-hmm.
they need Jesus.
Right. Right.
And so these are the kind of phrases, though, that are often used in political discourse,
Yes.
where it's the exact same language, but a completely different angle on that language, a totally
Yeah.
different point of view, and a totally different theoretical understanding lies behind that use of language.
Well, isn't that the definition of out of context?
To some degree, and I mean, I think to some degree, it's just there's a linguistic philosopher I love to quote. His name's Forsberg, and he basically talks about losing control of our own language.
Yeah.
The words stay the same, but the concepts that lie behind the words shift. And so we soon find that we lose control of our own language because the words we're saying no longer mean what they used to mean.
Yeah. It used to be called the dumbing down of the English language,
That's
and
right.
so uh,
But to go back to the statement, I think that's what's happening with some of these statements. When we
right.
read these and we say, is the United States, the true culture of the United States is fundamentally Christian?
Right.
To strongly agree with that, I think is problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To somewhat agree with it with a lot of qualification, I have more sympathy with.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know, you know, at the end of the day, though, I would probably personally just strongly disagree with it
Right. Well.
because, fundamentally Christian, at root Christian
Mm-hmm.
means something theologically to me that I don't think America ever has or could ever embody. The only thing with a culture that is fundamentally Christian is the church.
Right. Well, and I think when you look at this, go back to it, and you figure the true culture, and you think about this whole question that we're talking about,
Yep.
it really does have something to do with linguistics and also what we have made words out to be and how they've whether they've evolved or whether they've dissolved.
Yeah,
So
it does. And I think, as we sort of close out this conversation, we want to take one more break and then we'll come back and close it out. But I think it's just really important to understand the other phrase in this statement, true culture.
right.
Because I think that's a really key term there. In addition to fundamentally Christian, which we've kind of talked through already. When we
Mm-hmm.
come back, let's talk about true culture and kind of dig into that phrase a little bit and see what we come up with.
All
So
right.
we'll be right back. Hey everybody, welcome back to Thinking Christian. We are going to kind of close out this segment and our analysis of this first statement here in the Neighborly Faith Report. The true culture of the United States is fundamentally Christian, by talking a little bit about what might we mean by true culture.
Hmm.
Now, like we talked about earlier, culture is notoriously difficult to pin down. What is it? Um, Often I think of it just in terms of, sort of the underlying ways that we make sense of the world around us. It involves the artifacts that we find meaningful. It involves the actions and rituals that we participate in. It involves the generalized way in which we think and prioritize
Hmm.
our various actions, and even just the way we make sense of various aspects of our world. All of that sort of balled up into one big thing that is culture, I think.
Right. I wondered a little bit because last episode we talked a little bit about the whole woke, uh,
Hmm.
and I think you even brought that up as being almost a religious type of thing or religion in itself. But uh, you know, I had alluded to the fact that we were talking about, and you think about culture, that was a song that was written by a blues singer, Hootie Leadbelly, and he was talking about the Scottsboro Boys and the trial that was going on at that time, and he said if you go down there, meaning the South,
Hmm.
you better be woke. You better be aware that
Sure.
they're going to be gunning for you. They're going to be ready for you.
Yeah.
And so that's where it came from. We were talking about words and some of
Yeah.
these words, and unfortunately, some candidates are using that in a very derogatory way, and so people are taking that as almost racist in a lot of ways.
I think, for one, I agree with you. I mean, that term woke, awake, has been around a long time. I mean, Paul even uses it in First Thessalonians, encouraging them to remain awake, right?
Right.
And
He
and
doesn't
it
say
has
woke though.
this, right. It does say, but it intends to activate this idea of, very much to, similar to what Jesus talks about in his parable of the bridesmaids who are waiting, and they need to stay up and be alert. It has this notion of alertness to it, and but it has changed over time, and now I think, yeah, there's definitely an argument to be made that woke ideology has a number of similarities to religion.
Right.
And but I would say, and I've used that argument before. I think it's an important argument to be made, specifically within the woke context.
Mhm.
Uh, what I would also just affirm, though, is that, and I've said this before, the world tells stories and is becoming increasingly proficient at telling stories that
Right.
distort and deny God.
Mhm.
And so, what I think we have is, um, if we whittle down religion into one of its functions,
Right.
the distinction between sacred and profane,
Right.
I think we have a number of different entities that are helping us, and I say helping, I suppose, in air quotes, helping us uh, to distinguish between sacred and profane.
Right.
And it isn't a question of, deep morality at that point, right? I'm not questioning, I'm not suggesting that there's some sort of relative truth out there and nobody knows what's right and wrong. And morality is a slippery slope. Morality is somewhat separate.
Hmm.
Usually, when we're in the realm of sacred and profane, what we're really talking about is appropriate and disgusting, right? So,
Right.
what do we find disgusting? That is the profane thing. Where does our disgust reflex come from? That's the profane thing. And so, as we look at something like woke, right, what we're seeing is we're being asked to, in many ways, view certain groups of people as disgusting.
Yeah.
And that is a distinction, I think, between the sacred and the profane.
Yeah.
And you see it on the other side as well, conservatism. Sometimes we agree. For instance, in the realm of abortion, we tend to agree with more non-Christian conservatives that the abortion of babies is disgusting. And so there's a shared understanding and at least an overlap in visions between what is sacred and profane in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
But on a whole other level, there's a lot of times where conservative movement is urging us to see something as profane, as disgusting, when what we should be seeing it as is lost.
Right.
And so those are areas where we have to be very careful not to demonize one false religion over another, right?
Right. Right.
I mean, I think there are certain, it's like, uh, this will be a little bit of a weird analogy, but people I think will follow it, right? Um, there's a time to save the whales, right? There's a time to
Right.
save the whales. If the whales are going extinct, we don't step back and and go, well, all fish are really important, right? Like we should just be saving all the fish. I know whales aren't fish. No
It's
biologists
okay.
call
No.
in or put
Yeah,
comments
that's
in.
right. Yeah.
But the idea is that at some point there's going to be an emergency. In other
Yeah.
words, the world is going to be pressing in on something,
Mm-hmm.
pushing itself and us along with it to some degree
Mm-hmm.
towards something false, toward a
Right.
conception of reality and the distinction between sacred and profane that is going to absolutely distort God in a very particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to address
Right.
those things. We need to address it with the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
But that shouldn't blind us to the fact that all of the world's mechanisms are doing this in different ways that may be more mundane than this
Right.
one emergency. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I've been asked to speak on woke and critical race theory, I really do try to be relatively calm about it because what I think critical race theory and woke are is it's just the current iteration of the world moving toward death.
Mm.
But it's not that much different than any other world system you could think of.
Right.
And so if you think about it, an over dependence on military power, we
Mm-hmm.
see that reflected in scripture that that's not a good thing.
Right.
An overemphasis on or an over reliance on wealth. Well, you can't serve God and money. So we've got all of these different human systems
Right.
that are not they're antithetical to the Bible
Mm-hmm.
because people tend to depend on them as opposed to tending to depending on Christ.
Right.
And so all of them are theologically problematic.
Yeah.
It's just that some of them are like, you know, the weapon that's being pointed at you right now is always the most important one. And so that's the one we're addressing. It doesn't mean that the rest aren't a problem.
Right.
So that's sort of my take on how this all works itself out in a culture is that
Mm-hmm.
we're in the midst of a culture that is increasing, that is always trying to distort God. It's
Right.
always denying him. And so
Yeah.
everything that it does, we need to be not opposed to, but wary of.
Right. Yeah. Which I agree. I think to wrap this up, you think about the human condition,
Yep.
and one thing that we don't do as a culture, a true culture, is that we're not honest that we're all
Right.
sinners, that we're all sinners,
Right.
and we're not humble enough to. So all those three things are all part of the human condition, and so we are made to try to fake it till we make it, and if we were less that, we'd have a lot less of this kind of conflict.
Well, and I'll just take it one little step further and say what I really hear you saying is that the basic problem facing humanity is sin. And
That's
the only
exactly.
solution to that basic problem is Christ. And so if the church, which is the only entity that is capable of proclaiming Christ in word and deed
Mm-hmm.
surrenders that task by merging itself with the state, we have done a disservice to everyone we're trying to help. We're no longer accomplishing our own task, and we're not helping those that we are sent to help. We're not proclaiming to those who are lost what we are supposed to proclaim to them. And so this point that like, and I realize it can sound really simple and sort of trite, right? But what I would encourage people to do is actually think about this really, really deeply. Because if we can hold this theological center, that the church should do what the church should do, basic, church should do what the church should do, and it shouldn't do any more than that. The church should just do what the church should do. The church shouldn't be the state at all, right? Doesn't preclude individual Christians from serving in the state. Like, I'm not saying that, but the church should be the church. The church should do what the church should do.
Mm-hmm.
If we could just grapple with that and make that our center for how we're going to go about engaging the world around us, I think we'd be in much better shape.
I do too. And, be more like Paul, who begins so many times, I am a sinner.
Yeah.
But I'm saved by grace. And those two truths are really what the true culture it should be about.
That's what the true culture of the church is. And I think that's what, if that is really the true culture of the church, if the true culture of the church is rooted in Christ, we are going to be a sign to the rest of the world that there is a better, wiser way out of this quagmire that we find ourselves in a broken, fallen world than trying to sort through political, economic, social, whatever solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church is, to some degree, intended to be a sign to the rest of the world that God's word is true, that God is real and active, and that when we obey him, that is our best possible strategy for navigating the broken world in which we live.
We'll let that be the last word. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. And next time, we are going to look at another one of these statements from the Neighborly Faith Report. We've got two more that we really want to do. The first one is the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. We're going to examine that one. And then we're also going to switch. That's another one on which, the folks who were classified as adhering to Christian nationalists or adhering to Christian nationalism strongly agreed. And then I want to kind of flip the script. There's one that those who adhered to Christian nationalism very much strongly disagreed, and proportionally much higher than anyone else did. And that's religion has no place in government. So over the next couple episodes, we're going to be looking at those as well. So please feel free to come back. Hopefully these conversations are interesting and thought-provoking, and just appreciate you listening. So take care, everybody. Thank you.